Our project file as of right now is very messy. We do have these locators which helps us move around the song, but actually navigating through the different elements like the drums and the synths is kind of a pain given how much stuff is going on. So to fix this and to start the mixdown, we're going to start putting all of our tracks in groups. I want to make a group for the drums first, so I'm going to click and highlight every drum rack and every drum element. And then we'll right click on any of the tracks, and then click on group tracks. And there we have a group. We'll just call this one drums. And we'll do this for most of our tracks. We won't put the vocals in any group because we only have 2 samples going on. But if we had multiple vocals going on, we would put all of them in a group, and we'd probably process all of them with this effect track. We'll group this MIDI file and the operator into a sub-bass group. I'll explain the MIDI in a minute. Group all of our basses into a bass group. We'll do the same thing for our leads. I count this little riser as a lead, so we'll put it in there. And before I group any more tracks, one element of the song that was actually so subtle I forgot to mention it was this little ambient track, this one right here. You can make ambient pads in several different ways, but the way I made this pad was by taking Ableton's Grand Piano preset, the one that comes default with every copy of Ableton, and then adding a lot of effects onto it, adding some distortion and EQing, and then of course reverb because it's a pad, to create this very organic sound that's harder to achieve from a synth. The inspiration from the sound actually came from 40, who is well known for producing most of Drake's songs. In an old interview of his that I read, he stated that a lot of his ambient pads, which people think are synths, are actually piano sounds that he distorted and put other effects on. So with that inspiration, I made this ambient pad, and I use a similar technique for a lot of ambient pads in my songs. We won't be grouping this, but if we had more ambient pads that we wanted to process all together, we'd be grouping those. And for our last group, we'll take our 3 effects, and then we'll click Group Tracks, and we'll just call it Effects. Now that we have everything in groups, it's a lot easier to look at and a lot easier to manage. If I want to look at my drums, I can just click, and there's my drums. I can tweak anything I want to, and when I'm done with that, I can click again, and it's gone. While the cleaner aesthetic and convenience might be a nice feature of grouping sounds, the main reason why I put sounds of the same category into these different groups is because it's essential for making a good mixdown on your tracks. Basically what I'll be doing for these groups is I'll be putting effects onto the groups themselves to compress all of the sounds together, putting them at an even volume, and having them all affected together. This is very easy to manage, and it's a lot more convenient than if you tried doing something like taking all of your drum racks and putting the same effect on them. That would also eat up a lot more CPU. So, because our drums are the first group we made, we'll start with those. We're going to take the group and put it at minus 4.2 decibels. And we're going to add our first effect, which will be an EQ8. Let's take our first band and change it over to a low cut times 4. We'll put the frequency at about 50 hertz. That might seem like we're cutting out too much bass at first, but remember that the sub bass is taking care of all of that very low action. So if we had too much of that going on with the other sounds, it'd get very muddy. About 40 to 50 hertz works really good for kicks and snares where you just want enough punch. Now we'll take our 4th EQ band, which is a high shelf. We'll put this at about 5.10 kilohertz. And now we're going to solo our group. And now let's play the patterns that we have going on within the group, and we'll increase the gain while that's happening and see if we get a good sound. Maybe about 1.12. We'll just type that in. Boosting up those high frequencies just enough so it doesn't become dull. Now we're going to add on a compressor. We'll set the ratio to about 2.51. And And now let's play with the attack and see if we get a good sound. I think 4.99 milliseconds is good. And we'll leave the release at 50 milliseconds. And now we'll turn down the threshold. About minus 10.9 decibels. That actually sounds really great. And that's all for the drums group. That compressor adds a really nice punch to the sounds. We're not going to do anything to the vocals because we've already had them processed. Let's go to our sub bass. We'll turn it down to 0.9 decibels. And now we're going to get into the world of ducking, or sidechaining as you may know it. Basically taking a sound and having it mute whenever the kick or snare plays, and then when the kick or snare is finished, having the sound go back up in volume. Instead of doing traditional sidechain compression by taking a compressor and linking it to a certain drum sound, we're going to get a third-party plugin. I'm going to use LFO Tool, but you can also use Volume Shaper if you want to. We'll drag that onto the group. And I already have a preset that I made specifically for the sub bass. We'll be using this Dubstep preset in a minute as well. You can see for this preset, I set the MIDI to be note retrigger, and I set the rate to be 1/16. And the reason why I set the rate so high and I turned the envelope on note retrigger is because we're actually going to be controlling LFO Tool with MIDI. Now, if I didn't have the note retrigger on, then the sidechain would be at 1/16 and it'd be going crazy fast. But by putting it on envelope, that means it's going to play this pattern, and then when the pattern's done, instead of replaying, it'll keep playing the sound in consistent volume until another MIDI note hits, and it'll go back to this pattern, and it'll keep repeating in that form. Now to get the MIDI working, let's close LFO Tool, and now you should know why I have all of these blank MIDI channels lying around. Click on the I/O button, which is on this right corner. We'll go to our blank MIDI track, which is grouped with operator in the subgroup. We'll click on the output, and we'll change it to our group name, which in this case is sub. And there we go. Now the sub bass volume is being controlled with LFO Tool and MIDI. That works really well, but we can hear some clicking noises going on, and I don't really like those. So let's go back to our group, and after LFO Tool, we'll put on an EQ8, and we're going to get a high cut ×4, and let's cut out all of those high frequencies. The exact frequency doesn't really matter as long as you're not cutting out the whole sound. We just need to make sure that those high-end clicks aren't coming through. So I guess we'll just leave it at 160. Also remember that you have to put the EQ8 after the LFO Tool. If you put the LFO Tool after EQ8, then the clicking sounds will still occur because you're not filtering them out. And now we have the sub bass without the clicking sounds, and it's still being modulated with LFO Tool. Sounds really good. Now we're going to move on to our bass, and this is probably going to be the most heavy effect processing we're going to get into with this project file. But before we put the effects on, let's change the volume of this group to -7 decibels. And for our first effect, we're going to add on EQ8. We'll take our first band, change it to be a low cut ×4, and set the frequency to be 50 Hz. Now we're going to add on a third-party effect. We're going to add Camel Crusher. I've been using this in a lot of my videos because it's free and it works great. We're going to set this to be the Tube Warmth preset. Turn off the filter. Leave the compressor off. And now let's play our bass group, and we'll tweak with the distortion settings. Don't think a lot needs changed. Reduce the tube, maybe increase the mech a little bit. I think that's good. Yeah, we'll leave it there. Now we're going to be modulating the volume of this drop bass the same way we did the sub. So let's add LFO. So let's put LFO Tool on. And we're going to set this to the Dubstep preset that I made. And we'll also be using that on the leads in a minute. Don't need to change any of this because the preset's already set up 100%. And once again, we'll open up the bass group. We'll go to our MIDI track. We're going to go to our output. We'll set this to bass. And now we'll go to this little panel below. We'll change it to LFO tool because we don't want Camel Crusher. And there we go. Now the volume is being modulated by LFO tool on the bass group, and it sounds great. Let's hear that in context with the drums. And if you're wondering why I like adding this ducking to the group so much, it's because it really gives every sound some space to breathe. You can hear the drums and the bass and everything so much more clearly, and stuff isn't being cluttered because it's all playing on top of each other at the same time. And for our last effect on the bass group, we're going to add on another third-party plugin. We're going to be adding on Data Life's Sausage Fattener. Now this is a plugin that some people look at as being sort of a joke, and with the little cartoon sausage, it's not hard to see why. But I actually use this plugin very frequently, and when used subtly and in small doses like how I'm going to show you now, it's actually very effective, and it can take a lot of the hassle and work out of getting a good mix down. What you might spend hours on with compression plugins, you can get very quickly by adding just a little bit of sausage fattener. Let's solo the bass group again, and we're going to listen to it. And while we listen to it, we'll tweak with the fatness knob and see if we get a sound we like. "19% sounds really good. We're not getting an overly distorted and obnoxious sound, but it's more warm and in your face, and it works super well. And that's all for the bass group. Before we move on to our leads group, one subtle thing that I want to show you that I sadly didn't get the chance to, this is a very cool thing you can do with your dubstep songs, is to take basses that you use in the drop and then incorporate them in a very subtle way during the verses. We'll listen to verse 1 again, this time now we've got some more effects processing on, and let's see if you notice anything. If you were listening closely, you probably heard that there's actually a growl sound going on in the verse. I have growl 1 playing at a more quiet volume, and I added some heavier reverb onto the sound. Another thing that I feel is worth mentioning, I also added the reverb to that growl that I use as a transitional sound between the verse and the breakdown. I added some heavier decay time, and I had the dry wet turn up, as you can see right here. And I actually had the volume of this growl turned down during this transitional section, and I had it turned back up during the drop. You might want to experiment with having the volume fluctuate like this, because in a part of the song where there's different elements going on, a bass might seem like it's at the perfect volume, but then when you move it over to a part of the song where there's not much going on, suddenly it might seem overly loud. Let's move on to our leads. Put this down to minus 3.0. And the first effect we're going to add is more of a musical element rather than a mixdown element, but I couldn't really do it effectively before I added the sounds into the groups, so we'll add it now. We're going to add a frequency shifter, and this is a very cool way to create tension with build-ups for your song, and it can take some effort out of making a lot of rising synths, because with the frequency shifter, it makes the sound go up or down depending on where you put the hertz at, and it gives it sort of a weird, nasty sound that might not work well on other parts of the song, but for the build-up sound really great. We're going to go to our first breakdown / build-up, highlight the course of frequency shifter, and let's drag that up. Just put that at about 2.24. Doesn't really matter as long as it's going up in some way. Now we'll take the dry wet. We'll have it go up to 100% just before the vocal sample comes in. And seeing how we don't want the leads to sound nasty throughout the whole song, we'll go just before the drop and turn the dry wet back down to 0%. And now we'll take this and copy it, and we'll put it at the second breakdown. And there we go. That's a really great way to make build-ups. Now for the mixdown part of the leads group, we're going to add on an EQ8. We'll make our first band a low cut times 4. And we'll set the frequency to 104 Hertz. Get rid of the unnecessary low sounds because we have mostly high lead sounds going on. And even the mid bass, we don't want occupying too much low end. Now we'll take our fourth band, which is a high shelf. We'll set this to be at about 5.29 kilohertz, 5.35, that'll work. And now we'll play our group. And let's see if we get a sound we like when we increase the gain. Think about 2.14, maybe 2.11. That works really well. Now we'll add on another sausage fattener. Let's play our group and turn up the fatness. I like it on 11%, that works really well. And now we'll add LFO tool. We'll switch it over to the preset that I made. And once again, we'll set the output to our group, which is leads in this case. And there we go, now we have the ducking effect with the leads. And for our last group, we're going to look at our effects. Now the effects I grouped together purely out of convenience. The individual sounds themselves already have effect processing on them. You can see that these sweeps have reverb and EQ8 put on them. This sweep has an EQ8 on it, and then our little gunshot sound has the EQ8 and reverb, and it's at the low end and everything. If you want to, you can add some compression, maybe some reverb onto your effects groups, and I've actually done that sometimes. But for this song, it's not really necessary. And one final thing, when you have your song fully mixed down and you're ready to export it to either master it yourself or get an audio engineer to master it, you want to set the master volume to something relatively low. This is so you don't get distortion and clipping issues. I like to set my masters to be at a relatively low level, like -12. And there we go. That's how I construct, arrange, and mix down my dubstep tracks. So that was my tutorial. I hope you enjoyed it. Please like this video and leave a comment as it really helps us out. And please subscribe to our channel if you haven't already.